from here.
Welcome, everyone, to our November 3rd Thursday. Today, we will be talking about breaking the mold, experimenting with structure, a very exciting topic, and we have three incredible authors here with us to talk about this. We have our first panelist is Dr. Taylor Byas. Dr. Taylor Byas is a Black Chicago native currently living in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she is an assistant features editor for The Rumpus, an acquisitions poetry editor for Variant Literature, a member of the Beloit Poetry Journal editorial board, and a 2023 to 24 National Book Critics Emerging Fellow. She is the first place winner of the 2020 Poetry Superhighway, the 2020 Frontier Poetry Award for New Poets contest, and the 2021 Adrienne Rich Poetry Prize. She's the author of the chapbook Bloodworm from Variant Lit, a second chapbook Shudder from Madhouse Press, and her debut full-length I Done Clicked My Heels 3 Times from Soft Skull Press, which won the 2023 Maya Angelou Book Award and is shortlisted for the 2023 Chicago Review of Books Award in Poetry. She is also a co-editor of the Southern Poetry Anthology, Volume X, Alabama, forthcoming from Texas Review Press, and Poemhood, Our Black Revival, a YA anthology forthcoming from HarperCollins. Taylor, we are so incredibly privileged to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Our next panelist is Jennifer duBois. Jennifer duBois is the author of The Last Language. Her first novel, A Partial History of Lost Causes, was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award for Debut Novel and winner of the California Book Award for First Work of Fiction. Soon after its publication, duBois received a Whiting Award and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 Award. Her second novel, Cartwheel, was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award and the winner of the Housatonic Book Award. And her third novel, The Spectators, was a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship and a Civitella Ranieri Fellowship. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Stanford University's Stegner Fellowship, duBois teaches in the MFA program at Texas State University, and she lives right here with us in Austin. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And our third panelist is Sarah Viren. Sarah Viren is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and author of 2 books. Her essay collection, Mine, won the River Teeth Book Prize and the GLCA New Writers Award, and was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award and longlisted for the PEN Diamondstein Spielvogel Award, for the art of the essay. Her memoir, To Name the Bigger Lie, released this year, was an editor's pick by the New York Times. She teaches in the creative writing program at Arizona State University and lives in Tempe, Arizona, with her wife, 2 kids, and a mutt named Oki. Sarah, we are incredibly privileged to have you here today. We're so excited to have all 3 of you here today. And I know we've talked a lot already with the announcements and introduction, so I really want to jump straight into this discussion on structure. So I'd like to start with talking about the concept of a mold, since the name of this panel is called Breaking the Mold. Each of your books has a very clear touchstone that it's in conversation with. Taylor, your book is in conversation with The Wiz. Jennifer, there's a couple Nabokov books that your book is in dialogue with. Sarah, your book is heavily in dialogue with Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So I'd love for each of you to begin by giving us kind of a short introduction to your book, but in that introduction, talking about the mold that you were working from, and how the mold influenced the structure and how you broke from it. And Sarah, I'd love to start with you.
Okay, because we have the same name.
Yeah.
Um, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Well, so I think of, so my book is very much in conversation with Plato's allegory of the cave, and then within that allegory is within a dialogue called Plato's Republic. And the dialogue itself is thinking about, it starts with the question of like, what is justice? And through that question ends up tackling a number of subjects that are kind of pertinent to the book. Like, what does it mean for something to be true? What does it mean to try to build an ideal world? What does it mean to educate, etc. But the allegory itself has four parts, and they're not distinct when you read it, but when it's sort of been looked at, when we look back on it, we can see there's sort of four stages. And I was really interested in those four stages as applicable for thinking about the ways that one might come to knowing or to realization of having been like gaslit or tricked. So this idea of this process of like coming into enlightenment or understanding, this idea of these four stages. And so the book from the start, I knew would have four stages and sort of four parts, and it has those four parts. But the other thing I was really thinking about with the book was what Virginia Woolf has written about memoir. And so I talk in the book a lot about, she sort of lays out this idea of that a memoir is inherently a conversation between the self that's writing the book at this moment and the self that's being remembered. And so she calls them this I then and I now. And I think that was really helpful for me, because the book is so much about, it's about shadows in Plato's allegory of the cave. For people who don't remember, it's a story about people being trapped, this idea of people trapped in a cave. They're staring at shadows that they think are real. And then somebody finally realizes that they're not real. He gets up, escapes to the outside, and sees what is really real in the outside world. But within a shadow, we have a shadow and a self. We have this sort of idea of the two selves that Virginia Woolf was talking about, this idea of doubling and reflection and mirroring. And so that was really, really helpful. But the thing if we're talking about molds, what often happens in memoir, and the way that memoir can work a lot of times, is that it really is embedded in this idea of memory, right? And so what memoir does is it's investigating memory, and through the memory, it's trying to understand the self. And so in a sort of traditional memoir, there's a movement between that I then and I now that's sort of fluid as we tell the story. And I knew that wasn't the way I wanted to do it, because I really wanted to try to interrogate Plato's story and both see what was wrong with it and question it and understand it, and sort of in some ways map my own allegory or my own version of that allegory. And so with the structure of those four parts, what I was allowed to do was, rather than sort of move back and forth between the I then and I now, between these two selves throughout the book, there was a real juncture between each part. And that idea of like juncture and interruption and disruption felt really important to the book itself, because at the heart of the book are two men in my life who have like manipulated the truth or lied and disrupted the sort of stability of life. And so the book is an interrogation of like the damage that they did, and more generally then the damage that takes place when somebody does interrupt that sort of stable truth or understanding of what is real. And so by the four parts, I think there was something in those four parts that allowed me to explore the idea of interruption or juncture or like sudden change that also takes place in the allegory, where somebody moves from like seeing shadows to seeing light. And that structure is very different than I think what we have traditionally in memoir, but it felt like the right structure for me in interrogating the subjects that were inherent to this book. So in some ways, I was that idea of Plato's story allowed me to get away from how I might have traditionally have written a memoir if I didn't have that story at the center.
Oh, thank you. And Jennifer, what about you?
That was really interesting to listen to, Sarah. So my novel is about sort of a failed philosopher of language, or a failed linguist who has a series of tragedies befall her, and she gets kicked out of her academic program, and she takes a job at a controversial center. This is back in 2001, where she learns how to become a practitioner of facilitated communication, which was this controversial technology that was used to help non-speaking people with motor impairments of various kinds communicate. But because it involves the therapist stabilizing the hands of the patient, it was always like very controversial as to whether this was like a legitimate technology, or whether perhaps the therapist would be sort of subconsciously or unconsciously guiding the hands of the patient. This is very different from the kinds of technologies that are used today to help people who are non-speaking. So the book sort of hinges on this relationship that she develops with her patient, Sam, who's a 28-year-old man who doesn't speak and who has some motor impairments. She begins a relationship with him as his therapist in this context. They sort of immediately have this breakthrough. He reveals himself to have this, incredible, wit, and, he's very literate, sense of humor, and they fall in love. And then she ultimately winds up being discovered and arrested over questions of consent, because Sam's family believes strongly that, like, in fact, he was not capable of giving consent through this technology. And all of this sort of intersects with a lot of deep linguistic debates about the question of whether and to what extent language predates thought versus the other way around. So Angela kind of goes into this work as sort of a linguistic determinist, somebody who really believes that language is the only kind of mechanism by which we can have any kind of like fully human adult cognition, essentially. And then she pretty quickly abandons that intellectual, commitment as she gets to know Sam. So it's kind of a book that's pretty morally ambiguous, because you kind of have to come up with your own interpretation of what's going on. And if you read the conversations between Angela and Sam as being Angela's own invention, then you're essentially reading a story of, someone who's very self-deluded, who is sexually exploiting a disabled man. But if you read their conversations as legitimately an exchange between the two of them, then it's really a tragic love story in which they're, unfairly parted, and this man is deprived of his one mode of communication. So long story short, it's sad and depressing and dark either way. But all of that is to say that the two Nabokov books it engages with, it does so in two pretty different ways, I would say. On a superficial level, it like obviously borrows a structure from Lolita. You have like a first person narrator. She's not necessarily as charming as Humbert, but she's certainly like pretty cerebral, pretty clever in various ways, unfolding in this linear narration. She also tells the story as a direct address to Sam, which Lolita sometimes uses that device, but not very consistently. But in terms of its like structure, it really is kind of borrowing from Lolita. But in terms of its like moral question, or sort of the metaphorical question, I see it as much more in dialogue with Pale Fire, which is a book that Angela, the narrator, thinks about a lot throughout the text. In Pale Fire, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's this epic poem that's annotated by this man who fancies himself to be sort of the like expert on the poet, but in the course of the footnotes reveals himself to have this like very kind of deep obsession with a land called Zembla, and like maybe he's the king of Zembla, but maybe not, or maybe he wants you to think that he is. And it's this sort of hijacking of the poem by this like secondary character. Well, he's really the primary character in his fantasy. So to my mind, the like moral question or the metaphorical question was much more similar to Pale Fire, in that, to me, the question for Angela is really much more about, is she in fact, really inventing this sort of beautiful fantasy in which she's beloved and in which she's, special, and she's having this like, really deep sort of encounter with something that's true. And to me, that felt like a more appropriate, like moral or metaphorical analog for the situation than Lolita, because in Lolita, I don't know if other people had this experience of like reading Lolita as a young person, or maybe specifically as a young woman. And at least for me, when I read it as a teenager, I think I was like, oh, how morally ambiguous this is. And then I've grown up, but I'm like, it's not morally ambiguous at all. It's a wonderful book. It's one of my favorites. It's brilliant, charming, beautiful, witty. I think a gorgeous book, but what's interesting about it is not its moral ambiguity at all, actually. And my book, I hope what's interesting about it is the moral ambiguity, because it does present you with two possible readings, and in one reading, a certain kind of harm has been done, and in another reading, a different kind of harm has been done. And so all of which is to say, it takes sort of a structure from Lolita, but I think it's much more maybe spiritually kind of in line with Pale Fire in some ways.
Oh, thank you. You both have given us so much to think about already. Taylor, I'd love to hear about your book.
Yeah, so The Wiz is absolutely one of its biggest influences. The story of Dorothy kind of being whisked away from home via tornado, and then sort of has to take a journey through this magical land to find her way back home. I think what's interesting about like the idea of a mold is you typically think of like a mold existing and then pouring something kind of into it to fit the shape. And I think the like kind of opposite happened for my book first, whereas like the thing kind of existed first and then the mold was kind of put onto it to give it shape in a really interesting way. And so this book was like not this book at all before. And once I kind of got it to my press, my editor and we were having conversations about the organization and how we could like best kind of organize to tell the story that my editor kind of really saw coming through, which is ultimately this kind of like coming of age story of Black womanhood. And we started thinking about The Wiz because we saw this like love story for Chicago coming through, this exploration of home, and we were thinking about those themes. And then we were thinking about music, and we were talking about how the music in The Wiz kind of like serve as these markers, or if we're thinking about books, these kind of like chapters, for example, of how the narrative kind of moves through. And we were like, well, maybe we can use the music as this kind of organizing structure. And so thinking about the book in that way allowed us to see the structure of the book more clear and to kind of figure out how to put things in a certain order. And then I think as a result, also the narrative trajectory kind of clarified itself. So I think it all kind of worked backwards. But then, of course, The Wiz, at the end of The Wiz, Dorothy kind of returns home ultimately. And we don't really see what happens when she returns home, but we can assume that she returns home with this like renewed understanding and appreciation for, what is there in sort of her life. And I think the way that the book kind of departs from the mold of that is that there isn't a sort of return home, but a sort of understanding that perhaps being distant from home and perhaps staying away from home is kind of what's best for the reader to figure out how to better love herself. And so there's this kind of narrative departure at the end that I think only kind of came into focus because we kind of forced the mold onto the thing that already existed. So I think in a really interesting way, things kind of happened backwards for me, where the mold kind of came after the poems were written, and it helped us see what the book was needing to do more clearly.
Oh, that's so interesting. And that brings up a question of for you, Sarah and Jennifer, at what point in your process did the structure become clear? What was the components of the story that you were trying to tell that influenced the way you structured it? And did it change throughout? I know, Sarah, it sounds like you quite clearly knew you were going to have a 4-part structure. But at what point in the process did you know that? And did it evolve? Did it challenge you at some points to keep that, or did it change throughout?
Well, I think I actually didn't know that from the beginning. I really liked what Taylor said about structure being clarifying, you know, and I do think I've always been so fascinated by structure, and I think a lot about it. And I think that's because it's huge. It's a huge part of the meaning making of a story. And so, or of a collection of poems, like it, for me, it often clarifies. Once I land on the structure, it clarifies to me the entire project, because it has been it's fit into this mold, and now it takes this particular shape that you understand that maybe you didn't understand before. So when I started writing this book, I was actually just writing the first part of it. I was writing a book about a teacher in a high school I had in high school, who was my philosophy teacher, who taught me Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and who then went through this very weird conversion to Catholicism when I was in high school, and started being a sort of conspiracy theorist and taught Holocaust denialism. And so I had been grappling with that story. And there was very much, at some point I realized in the writing that there was very much a sort of cave within the story itself, because we, for those Floridians, or maybe others that grew up with these large expanding public high schools, we had a lot of our classrooms in these really dark, portable classrooms, because we were so overcrowded. And so a lot of the drama in that story took place in the sort of dark, dingy, portable classroom, from which I emerged at one point when I got in a fight with this teacher after he was teaching Holocaust denialism. And so that, you know, that was like the story. And then what happened is that I was writing that story, it got interrupted by another story that of a much more complicated story, but something that happened to me more recently, where a man I know made up a series of lies about me and my wife, an attempt to get a job. And so it was when that story interrupted the other, I suddenly, it was like juxtaposition, right? Like they suddenly were side by side, and I could understand that first story so much better when I experienced like a duplicitous man in a much different situation, but with similar stakes, right? The stakes were like, not somebody manipulating reality and you no longer having control over what your reality was, and sort of pushing back against that. And so when that happened, I knew those two stories, that I wanted to tell them together, but it was really hard to figure out how to tell them together. And I think that that's what I meant about there was a sense that what I heard from a lot of people, and the sort of encouragement I was getting, to sort of braid them in a sort of seamless way. And I think that might be our instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I started to try to do, but it never felt right. And I think that's when I suddenly landed on, it was only I was reading about other philosophers interpreting Plato's Allegory of the Cave and Plato's Republic more broadly. And, you know, it was in one of those where there was sort of this breakdown of these parts. And I thought, oh, that is so helpful, because in each moment, there is a moment of awakening, understanding, and change. But with each change, there's also like a new conflict, right? And I think I was most sort of moved by learning that there was an end to the story that I didn't learn in high school, which is that this person that escapes from the cave comes back. And he comes back, and the idea is that like he has to grapple with the reality that like we're always going to have people that are deluded or believing lies, or I mean, like that's reality. We're not going to always have this shared sense of like what is true and real, and that's like the messiness of human existence. And that idea that coming back, I think that's when I realized there's a fourth part, I was like, oh, that structure is so important. That coming back to just felt like, oh, that's really essential that's really essential to reckoning, not just finding out what's true, but reckoning with harm caused by lies. And so when I realized that, I was like, oh, that's why the book needs to be 4 parts. You know, so I don't think it was there from the beginning. I think it's very much like Taylor said, that when I realized it, it really helped me understand what was at stake in the book itself.
Oh, wow. Wow. Jennifer, what about you? At what point did you see the structure come together?
Sure. Well, I just realized like who Sarah is while you were talking. I realized I've read your essay about that, and like now I'm desperate to read your book, because I remember reading your essay about the guy impersonating you guys, and just finding it like baffling and compelling and horrifying in all the ways. So so the structure for this book, to tell you the truth, honestly, this is my like by far my most structurally straightforward book, because my previous 3 novels had multiple points of view. They had jumping around in time. My second two novels in particular really required like a lot of like moving chunks around and figuring out about timelines and like before and after. My third novel in particular, I for some reason decided I wanted to write like one POV in first person, like deep retrospective point of telling, and the other one in like third person present tense. So to be honest with you, the structure of this book really long predated the book, because after I finished my third novel, The Spectators, I said to myself, the next book I write is going to be one perspective, first person. It's going to be short, and it's going to be set in somewhere where I've actually like lived at the time that it's set, you know, so it's just like in Boston in 2003. It's you know, nowhere that I have to do research about. So but I think then on the other, you know, part of the answer is that like I think I have read and taught Lolita, you know, so many times, it's probably kind of like in my bloodstream in some deep way. And also even though like I've always been really interested in just the question of how is it that different people of goodwill and a reasonable intellect can look at the same circumstance and see wildly different things. And that's something that I think all of my books are really grappling with. The other books grapple with that more by showing you like a variety of perspectives, sort of a kaleidoscopic look at a single person or a single event. And in this case, you're only getting the one person's, you know, account of circumstances and her total monopoly on, you know, interpretation and meaning. But you certainly feel, and, you know, the sense of like the counterpoint of like other people's interpretations, and you certainly develop your own. So even though it's structurally much simpler, I think it's still sort of meditating on that same question that's always been there. So I think for one thing, the structure was just baked in as like I needed a break from the stuff that was more complicated. But then I think I was always probably, you know, I'm always interested in questions that have like a lot of like moral fraughtness to them, and that people see very differently. So in a way, it was a very natural fit to eventually do a book like this one.
Mm-hmm. And Taylor, we have to talk about the poems in your collection. You are a structural poetic genius. I have to say, I was just endlessly impressed with the way you moved from sonnets to pantoums to sestinas to erasure to a whole new form that was based on jeopardy. I mean, just your book has a million different forms in it, and they're all done flawlessly. So I'd love to hear from you. What does it mean for you to like write in a traditional structure? And then what does it mean for you to write in a freer structure? And why was it important for you to have such a variety in this collection?
Yeah. So I've always loved poetic form. I had a very interesting introduction to poetic form during my master's. I basically like had an 8-week sort of formal boot camp in which my professor gave me a new poetic form each week. Said, here are the rules, and here are some additional rules that I'm going to give you just for the fun of it, and just kind of released me into the wild to figure out the poem, and I would have to kind of figure it out by the end of the week. Sounds a little chaotic, but I think that introduction was really foundational in the way that I still engage with form, because in so many words, without really ever saying it, what he really wanted me to do was to figure out how to create possibility to make all of these crazy rules that he was giving me possible. And I think that early learning, that early introduction to form continues to inform like the fun that I have when kind of puzzling through form and trying to create possibility. So many times I hear people talk about form and it's like, oh, it's so, you know, I have no room to wiggle around. Like it's so, you know, restraining. And I think the fun comes when you're forced to step out of your comfort zone to figure out a way to make something work. And that's when the really exciting stuff happens. Formal traditions for me are especially important because I think there's a very complicated history, in particular when thinking about Black women poets and the ways that we've had to interact with poetic form, and the ways that we had to write in traditional poetic forms to kind of prove sort of authorial, worthiness or mastery, right? And so I think now to populate poetic forms with these stories about Black womanhood, these everyday narratives, stories, these love stories to Chicago, for example, these stories that have been traditionally, historically on the margins, I think are also like these really important disruptions of our literary canon. And so for me, it's also really important to continue to engage with form because I think that's work that I always feel committed to, and I hope I will always feel committed to doing. And I want to change the way that we teach form. I think a lot about how students now come to form, and I think about my introductions to form. Like I think students these days are a lot less enthusiastic about people like Shakespeare, for example. And I think there are so many barriers to engaging with a lot of older traditional form, language being one of them, relatability, those sorts of things. I think I think people need to encounter form that also reflects their lives, lived experiences themselves back to them, language that they recognize. And I think that changes the way that they think and understand form as well. So all of these things are in my mind in particular when I'm thinking about form and engaging with form. And I think form just also helps me just on an individual poem level, um, figure out what the poem is asking of me. Like, if I have a lot to say and I know that I need a lot of room to say it, I'm probably unfortunately going to reach for something like a sestina because she's she's long and gives me the room for that. If I have too much to say and I know that I probably need to get to the point, I'm probably going to try to work through it in a sonnet, right? There are these ways that I think the forms also like I can attach them to kind of what I need to work through or what the poem needs to work through in a really interesting way too. So yeah, those are all the ways that I think about form.
Yeah, I love that.
Can I say something about poetic form? Is that okay?
Yes.
Because I studied in grad school, I also took a class on poetic form, and I thought it changed my life. Like I'm almost entirely a prose writer, but learning exactly what Taylor said about the idea of like what's baked into a particular form and like what it's good at. And then the challenge of trying to write in a particular form. I really loved sonnets and the idea of the sort of argument of the sonnet. But as a prose writer, it was also really helpful. On my first book, it's an essay collection, and I was writing this one essay about singing a murder ballad to my daughter, my oldest daughter, when she was born. I would sing Tom Dooley, which is a song that my parents used to play for me, and it would put her to sleep. Like she would stop crying. And so I would sing like this murder ballad to her and she would stop crying and I would sing it again and again. And finally at some point my wife was like, that's a really bloody, like violent song that you're singing to our daughter. And I was like, shit, whatever. But then I started thinking, it's a song about violence against women. And so I was singing the song about violence against women to my daughter. And so the essay was about that, but I was trying to think about the form, and I'd been in this class, this poetic forms class. And so we'd studied the ballad form. And I ended up writing the essay in what I called ballad form, but what it was that each section, it would end with I had the rhyme that's it's A, B, A, B, right? I was trying to remember. And so and then there was like, I had it in this, like kind of 4 very long stanzas, right? And then it was just a small constraint. It wasn't really that big of a deal because it was the very last line that had to rhyme, but it brought the essay together. It allowed me to like make the argument or figure out the sort of moral quandary that I was trying to figure out. Like having that form was really helpful. And since then I've talked to other essayists in particular who have used poetic forms as sort of models for writing essays. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And I think that's can be really inspiring and fun, is like thinking about what poetry and poetic form can teach prose writers, right? And how it can sort of inspire us.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. I love that. Thank you for sharing, Sarah. Jennifer, do you have like an experience or with constraint or working within a constraint that kind of helps push you forward or?
Well, I mean, I guess in a way it's very different from I think what Taylor and Sarah are describing, but I think that at a certain point, like I've found it to just be sort of fun to experiment with different points of view. I mean, kind of what I was describing with my third book, where to tell you the truth, I think I just picked those points of views because I hadn't really done them that way before. Like I hadn't done third person present. I hadn't done this like deep retrospection. And you know, perhaps like not coincidentally, this was like a book that I had sort of conceived like when I still had like a writing fellowship, and then I had to like execute when I had a full-time job. And I was like cursing myself for years. Like, why did I commit myself to these like, you know, just these decisions? And then of course, in a lot of ways, like subtle and not so subtle, it shapes the story and it becomes a little bit like hard to, you know, even completely like parse out like you know, to what degree the form sort of predates the story, because they just are kind of like in constant, you know, mutual dialogue. But I can't say that I have ever, I mean, it's very interesting to, especially interesting to kind of hear how poetic form can be applied to prose. I can't say I've ever tried that, and I have no capacity to write poetry at all in any way. So it's an interesting thing to think about, like how even a person who's really not capable of writing poetry like might still like borrow and learn from some of the like macro elements of poetry that like a person, because I too am very interested in narrative structure. But you know, no, aside from doing like, you know, here and there, I've done like a, I don't know, I did like a footnote story once, like everybody does, but it's like at this point, who needs another? So
I like what you're saying though. You pick, you know, I'm going to do that. Like it's almost like a challenge for yourself, and you stick with it. And that is like kind of a form of giving yourself a constraint, and I really like that. Sarah, we have to talk about the final section of your book. There are so many breaks that happen from what comes prior, and I liked what you're saying about their junctures, but it also just felt kind of like the foundation was kind of moving throughout the book. There was this like push-pull between the present and the future and the past. And it kind of feels like it all comes to a head in that final section where you do some really interesting things. I'd love to hear you talk more about the writing of that section.
Yeah, that section is so in some ways the book, it's called a memoir, but you know, I'm really interested in nonfiction about and thinking about the different sort of forms that come to us in nonfiction, because nonfiction is this really strange genre where we like define ourselves in what we're not. We're not fiction, right? And yet we have a really deep history, right? The history of the essay is really long. The history of memoir goes back to like St. Augustine. Like, you know, we have like literary journalism came about the rise of the novel. Like the forms of nonfiction are really old, but yet and yet we're sort of ill-defined. And so I was writing this memoir, but it wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't really a memoir. it was in some ways an experiment with using different nonfiction forms to try to understand those larger concerns that I talked about at the beginning. And so the first part really is memoir, and people have said it's kind of novelistic. It's very, you know, like there's this way in which it's written and seen a lot of the time. And it's very much in that sort of perspective of the high school person who is me. It feels like another person. And then there's a next section that feels very much like essay, and it's sort of thinking through, you know, what happened with this character that I call Jay. And then the third part is it borrows from a lot of literary journalism, and I you know, I write as a journalist, and there's a lot of research in there, and I did interviews. And when I got to that fourth part, which is this part of like coming back, it's coming back. It's like, what does it mean to come back to the community? And I just thought, none of these forms have helped me figure out how I deal with these men and what they represent, like these men and their lies and like the harm and damage that is caused by that. And so what I finally decided was like, well, at some point I just was thinking about Plato in general and Socrates. And I was like, he was really like kind of a nonfiction writer. Like he like we know Socrates existed. We know he had these big conversations. Like these dialogues we could call them creative nonfiction. It just like nobody does. They call them philosophy. And so I just thought, I'm going to think about dialogues. Like I'm going to try to write in dialogues. And so the last section are a number of imagined dialogues, some of which are very, very strange, but were really fun. And some dialogues with the reader, and then some real dialogues because I reached out to Dr. Wiles, who was my high school teacher. So we had a real sort of real a real conversation in that, like, I didn't invent his words. But the imagined dialogues ended up being so helpful for me in thinking. That's what I realized. It was that I was able to think more clearly through imagination and through putting people, like, so for example, in one of them, I put Jay, this man who sort of ruined my life for a short period of time. And I put him in the classroom with Dr. Wiles, and he was who I was in high school, and he interacted with Dr. Wiles. And then there's another time where I imagined Dr. Wiles as a young man. And I think that there's something in there about empathy. Like if we imagine somebody as a younger person, it does allow us to have empathy and see them with more empathy, because we can see how they came to be, even if you're imagining it. And then there's another one where there's a lot of repetition, but I read No Exit in high school, Sartre's No Exit, and was sort of enamored of it because there's a lesbian character and I was coming of age. And so in one of those dialogues, I imagined Marta and me and Jay in the No Exit situation. And so like and that's another form of a cave, like I think that there was something about dialogues and imagination that allowed me to think through the questions of the book in a way that I hadn't been able to in any of those other sort of nonfiction modes up until the end.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it blew my mind.
Thank you. It makes me happy because some people have hated it, so I'm glad you liked
it. It was wonderful, wonderfully strange. And yeah, Taylor, let's talk a little bit about your book is very concerned with like inheritance. And and you talked a little bit about the inheritance of, traditional poetic forms. What were the ways that, just thinking through like kind of generational gifts and generational curses, how did that influence the writing of the book? How early did you know that was a theme in your book?
Yeah. So there's the kind of inheritance of being from Chicago. And I think that was kind of like the first maybe kind of inheritance that I knew was kind of at the foundation of the book. And interestingly enough, I think you can't really, or at least for me, I don't want to speak for other people, but I can't really think about what I inherit from a place until I leave it. And so I found myself, I went to undergrad and my master's in Birmingham, Alabama. So very, very, very different from Chicago, very far away from home. And I also found myself in Alabama during the 2016 election. So there was a lot happening. That was also very different from, where I'm from. And then I now have been in Cincinnati, Ohio for going on 5 years now. And so this book kind of was written like partially Birmingham and sort of mostly in Cincinnati. So I've been away from home kind of 5-6 years. I think when like most of this book was written. And in Birmingham in particular, it was always so interesting telling people that I was from Chicago, because that automatically, like, there's a whole sort of inheritance that comes with that. There's a sort of understanding that is then kind of put onto me because of where I'm from and what people think I have taken from Chicago. And so I think a lot of this book is about disinheriting, maybe. The book is like an attempt to disinherit this is toxic, dangerous sort of idea that people have about Chicago, that people have about, who or what you're supposed to be if you're from the South Side of Chicago. So many people, made comments like, oh, you must be a thug, right? You must be hard, you must be this, you must be that, which I think are, completely opposite of who I am as a person. And then there's a very personal sort of inheritance that I consider in the book. There's the inheritance of just kind of motherhood, being one an eldest daughter, right? And the sort of like labor that comes with that, and the sort of ways that we are asked to become second mothers to people, to other people. And then that is sort of doubly complicated by the fact that my father is an alcoholic. And so there's this additional way that I had to kind of become a caretaker in my family. And so a lot of the book is also just about disinheriting that legacy, disinheriting sort of putting the self last, which I think is a big reason why the book sort of doesn't end with the speaker returning home and kind of realizing that she needs to be away to kind of be her best self. But also disinheriting the sort of harmful legacy of accepting, the sort of harmful love of men who betray you and hurt you, which, the book kind of cycles through all the ways that dynamic kind of keeps showing up in romantic relationships. And the book kind of makes this argument for like breaking away from that as well, kind of at the end. So I think Inheritance was working on a lot of levels, but I think it definitely started with thinking about Chicago, thinking about geography, and sort of the places that we're from and the legacies and inheritance that comes with that. And then it kind of went from a more, I think, larger global to a smaller, more personal consideration of what the book tries to disinherit.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's interesting. All of your books are populated by, people of both genders, but the men are almost ancillary, and the really intimate relationships and interesting ones are the ones between women. Taylor, your favorite poem of mine is the one that's looking in a mirror, and it's, a mirror of your mother's image and yours, and it's really beautiful. And I know, Sarah, you were talking about the mirror being a big theme in your book. And Jennifer, I thought it was so interesting in your book, the book is largely, men are not speaking in the book, and it's the women interpreting men. And even in the case of the linguistic and literary theory that comes through, we're getting Angela's interpretation almost of these theories. I wondered if you could talk more about that inquiry that's throughout the book, that's like beautifully braided into the book, the linguistic and intellectual kind of thoughts she's having or telling us, and what they almost, it's like they're so integral, they almost seem like clues that will help us come to a conclusion about the controversy at the moral dilemma at the heart of the book. And I wonder if you could just talk about how you decided how to weave that in so flawlessly, and the bearing it had on the book.
Sure, I can try. Thank you. So sort of, as I said before, basically to put it very, over simply, the debate that exists within linguistics and that Angela is kind of like making her way through is this conversation about, linguistic determinism, this idea that, and to expand on it a little bit, it's not just that language predates thought, but that the sort of particularities of our native language shape the way we think in all kinds of ways, big and small, like everything from how we perceive color to how we perceive smell, to our sense of direction, to whether you innately, think of a table as having a gender, right? Because like a lot of Romance languages, a lot of languages do. And so throughout the book, she's using a lot of examples, which many of which I got from this wonderful book I'd recommend called Through the Language Glass by Guy Deutscher. It's just fascinating. And it's full of all kinds of like really interesting examples about how like Russian speakers have two different words for like dark blue and light blue. So they actually sort of group these as different categories, whereas there are languages such as the language of the Herero in Namibia, which perceives or groups green and blue together, and so perceives that as one. There's examples about languages where folks don't have words that like refer to the personal self in terms of direction. So they don't have like left or right. They only have cardinal direction. And so then have this like hyper developed sense of cardinal direction where like you can, move them anywhere, spin them around, like upside down, doesn't matter. It's like this developed sense, etc. So this is sort of like maximalist linguistic determinism, is this belief that the not only is language the way that we think, but the specifics of the language that is our first language really shapes us incredibly intimately in all of these really like detailed ways. And then of course, like most, like many things, there's a robust, rebuttal to this idea. There's a lot of, counter examples where you can point to examples where languages are similar but cultures are different, and there's different outcomes that kind of like run counter to these examples. So she kind of goes into her work, her academic work, very committed to that former philosophy, the idea of language predating thought and also shaping thought in every tiny dimension. She kind of abandons that over the course of her, getting to know Sam. And I think that that's something that's presented, hopefully it's something like everything in the book that you could read one of two ways. You could either see that as like her being really intellectually insincere, and that the second she wants something that's on the other side of her intellectual commitment, she just abandons it, or you could see it as like just human flexibility, because isn't that also pretty normal that sometimes we have like a like a sort of arid philosophical intellectual sense of like how things are, what something is, and then as soon as you encounter anything, any reality of it, you change your mind, hopefully. So basically she at the beginning of the book is like harnessing a lot of evidence in support of the linguistic determinist theory, and then as the book goes on, she's harnessing a lot of evidence that runs counter to it. And I did want it to feel not I wanted it to feel, organically impelled by her emotional and psychological trajectory, rather than just, neat bits of linguistic trivia throughout. And then I guess, I mean, the Chekhov and Nabokov stuff too. I mean, I guess there's, I mean, I don't want to take too much time on it, but I would say like they've kind of got a couple of different functions. One is that she's coming up with her own interpretations of these books that like may or may not be, she's reading a lot in, and then also kind of like seeing a lot of like metaphorical resonance to her life, and she may be misinterpreting these books in different, or the stories in different ways, maybe not. And the other big piece of it is that she sort of denies throughout her whole account that she's a literary person. Like she's constantly saying like, oh, I'm not a writer, I'm not a literary, I'm not, and it's like very obvious that she actually is. And that's kind of in there just to sort of address the question of like how could she, like if you're gonna go with the like read that like she did kind of invent all the language of Sam, like it's sort of meant to address like the question of like, well, like how would that work exactly? Like if this person's really not actually like a super committed, like linguist, like maybe not like a super intellectually coherent thinker in some ways, but she really is like a novelist, that made sense to me. So
yeah, I love she comments about, she says someone shrugged, and then she said, which is a thing people only say in novels. That's pretty great. That was very well done. So I'm going to see what questions we have from the audience here. So we had a workshop on 3-act structure last night. Could you speak to the areas where you followed some of the tricks of the 3-act structure and why, and where you diverged, and how you feel that still works or works better for the reader? Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I was actually thinking about the three act structure a lot. And one other text that I was kind of the book is in conversation with is Shakespeare's The Tempest. The title actually comes from a line from there that is that you taught me to name the bigger light. This idea of like learning to, The Tempest is really about power and education as well. It's about a lot of things, but and about lies. Um, and so obviously there's five act structure, but five act or three act, this idea of like this sort of this sense of rising action and then denouement. I was thinking about the sort of neatness of that with the book. And I think there's a real clear way in which I could have ended at this third part. And really the story itself has ended right at that third part. And I wanted that fourth part for the kind of unevenness that it created, the sense of pushing beyond sort of the neatness of that structure. So I was thinking a lot about the way that plot wise the three act structure works, and I think that something I was thinking about a lot in the book was how does plot interact with thinking, right? Like how does the stories that I tell, particularly the story that Jennifer, you said you've read, and I think a number of people had read before, there's a lot of sort of narrative tension to that story, right? There's a sense in which that story does have this sort of not necessarily, but it has a sort of shape of a three act play. And I feel like that was really compelling for feeling what it feels like to be sort of trapped in a lie and come out of it. But what I was interested in, again, in that fourth section was thinking through like, okay, what is the aftermath of that? Like, what is just past the denouement, and somebody that was really influential to me, I don't know if others have read her, but Janet Malcolm, who's a New Yorker writer, she's in some ways compared a lot to Joan Didion. Joan Didion is like so influential for essayists like myself, but Janet Malcolm, I think, is sort of was a brilliant essayist, and her books, I've been slowly working my way through all of them. And what they do, she always goes past when you think the ending will happen. And the most interesting stuff always happens in her books at this moment in which it's like everybody else would have ended the book there, and she keeps going. So yeah, I was thinking a little bit about that. What does it mean if you imagine a three act structure? What does it mean to go past it? Right? What does it mean to keep going? And how does that sort of change the shape of the story? And for me, it was about allowing for some sort of maybe thought and play that is maybe outside the scope of that sort of three act structure.
Oh, yes. Thank you. And Taylor, I imagine you have a similar feeling given the non-return, but do you have anything you're thinking about three act structure wise?
Yeah, I think sort of by nature, because the book is kind of a coming of age story, that it kind of adheres pretty closely to the three act structure. But I'm also thinking about like I'm thinking about resolution in particular, especially after Sarah was talking about it, because I think there's like two ways that we think about resolution. There's like the kind of like narrative resolution of does this story ending feel like something has been resolved or something has been like wrapped up? And then there's also, I think, in particular, I think with poetry collections for me, and there's also the sense of like, does this like final poem feel like an end? Like does this final poem feel like it's supposed to be at the end of the book kind of thing? Like not a narrative, but a structural question. So I think it's really interesting that I'm especially when reading poetry collections and even thinking about poems and putting together poetry collections myself, there's kind of two ways that I'm thinking about resolution. And sometimes sometimes they're not aligned. Like I remember, I think I just read Coal Mountain Elementary. And I feel like the final book, like I couldn't imagine any of the other poems being at the end of the book. Like I think that had to be the final piece. But I also feel like the book is unresolved in a lot of ways. And so I also think it's really interesting how we can maybe think about like resolution in kind of two different ways, and how sometimes there's like satisfaction in one area and maybe dissatisfaction in another. Um, and in all of the ways that I think resolution considers like the reader or the audience, right? Like Sarah, you were talking about this idea like anyone else would have ended the book here, or there's this kind of like maybe intuition as a reader, like the book should have ended here. There's something about I think the way the audience comes into play, in particular when thinking about resolution and where a thing feels like it should end. And I think really interesting ways that we I think push against that sometimes and some really interesting results, it seems, when that happens.
Yeah, it's so interesting in poetry collections too, because it's not as if the poems are assembled in the order that they've been written, or even necessarily that they've been written with a structure in mind, like in your case. So it's like you're building it and deciding where that ending note is going to be. And it's a really tactile thing. It's really interesting. Um, Jennifer, what do you think about the 3-act structure?
Well, so I think again, like with this book, this was the closest I've ever written in novel form to something that was just really like a Freytag's pyramid, essentially, because it really is, like two people meet and they fall in love and then they're parted. So just structurally, plot wise, it just does that. But what's different about it is that I think the way it subverts it is that for one thing, you kind of know all that up front. It's like within the first 5 pages, I think most alert readers will gather that like these people fell in love and now she's in jail, so it's sort of event is kind of foregone, and now the question is really the meaning of what happened. Like you sort of you have a broad sense of what events you're gonna perceive, but what you don't know is what you're gonna make of them, what you're gonna believe actually occurred here, whether you're gonna buy into her perspective or not. And so yeah, it's this book is like definitely structurally like very straightforward in terms of its plot and just sort of the sequence of events, but in another sense it's like the events are like slightly, they're not like beside the point, but they're a jumping off point to like what the book is really about, which is about interpretation and meaning making.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question in the chat box. In structures, I then and I now, how much hand-holding do you do for the reader in shifting from one to the other? In other words, do you consciously create traditional transitions? For example, the classic Proustian sensual transition, or do you write a scene from one structure and jump into the other structure, just using narrative or dialogue and let the reader figure it out?
I assume that's
Yeah,
like really
Sarah, please
Virginia will.
take us away.
Yeah, I mean, so I was thinking about Proust. I explicitly mentioned Proust at some point in the book because there was what happens in memoir and in memoir writing, and also the thinking behind memoir writing is that there are moments like Proust Madeleine that like suck us into the past, right? And I think we all have had that. Like there used to be this time where every once in a while I would smell like a certain yeasty bread smell, and I would just be on the highway driving my brother. He used to like visit when he was in high school, like he visited somebody near Orlando, and it was just like I would just repeat this memory. I would just go, I would be back on the highway dropping him off. And so there are these sort of like time tunnels that happen, right? That certain things that move us through time really, really quickly to a memory. And so memoir, that's kind of the engine of memoir, is paying attention to those and writing into those, because those are the moments where we are able to cross a large expanse of time and make connections, and connections is how we make meaning. And so I think that is one way that you do it. And something that Virginia Woolf says in that same piece of writing that I mentioned, where she's talking about, she's attempting memoir, and so she's talking about how she wants to do it. But she talks about what she calls the cotton wool of time, and that's kind of like this idea that like if we think of our past, it is kind of a cotton wool of time. Like like think back on even this day, but think back on several years, think back on your entire lived experience. Like most of it is cotton wool, meaning that it's like this sort of like fuzziness that we're not quite sure what is there. And she talks about shocks that happen, that there are shocks that happened in moments in time, and that's where the meaning lies. And part of it, she has this incredible essay, which I'm sure a lot of people have read because it's taught in high school. It's The Death of the Moth. And, it's this moment in which she's like, the speaker is there and sees a moth and the moth is dying. But what happens is that she slows down and just explains the death of the moth, and the death of the moth becomes a way of understanding like the life cycle and all of human existence. And like, it becomes a way of understanding everything. And she kind of makes that argument, and I very much buy into it. I think Proust did as well, and Nabokov did as well, in his memoir. But this idea that if we pay attention to what feels, whatever are these moments in time in our past that we are repeating for whatever reason. Sometimes we're repeating them because we know that there's a damage that happened that we're trying to figure out. But sometimes it's like that. I've never written about dropping my brother off in near Orlando, but there's something that happens. And so Woolf would call those shocks in the cotton wool, and that's where the meaning lies. And so in some ways, writing into those moments, and allowing yourself. I think that's the thing about memoir writing and about all writing, is like, we have to learn to really pay attention to our instincts and let them be, like let them exist, and not try to figure them out. And a lot of times in memoir writing, what's happening is that your instincts are to move through time for whatever reason, right, to a moment, and then you have to write to figure it out. And so I think that as far as then structuring it, the question is like allowing that to be inherent to the storytelling, right? Allowing the reader to feel that movement between two really disparate moments in time. Because I think the reader will inherently understand that and connect to it, because we all know what it's like to suddenly remember the past when we're, way in the future. Like the moment I always think about was, there was my oldest daughter, when at some point when she was like a baby, she went to grab there was a stream of water from the faucet, and she went to grab it, and like as if it were a solid, because she didn't realize it was a liquid. And I had this distinct memory, and maybe I'm imagining it, but I swear there was this moment where I was like, I remember that as a, like, I don't know, they say you can have memories of babies being a baby, but I distinctly remember thinking liquid was solid. And it was like such a profound moment. It's like, wow, this is a moment in which we realize what the world is, when we realize there's a distinction between liquid and solid. So I think it's like, yeah, being aware of those moments and writing into them.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah. You did that so well in your book. Like I said, it felt like the past was always present. It was very good. That was a great question. So I'm just going to do two final rapid fire questions to wrap us up. Who are the writers you look to as models for experimentation? Who do you see as breaking new molds or breaking new ground right now? Taylor, who have you been reading?
Thinking about poetic forms in particular, I was really fascinated with Ariel Marie's book Gumbo Yaya. I've been writing a lot of prose poems lately, and I think Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work is so fascinating to me in the way that it also brings in research. I think Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes is also one that has been really blowing my mind lately. Those are the ones that come to mind as I'm thinking about who's been on my mind now, especially as I'm like in new projects and writing. Those are people that are in the front of my headspace as I'm coming to the page.
That's exciting. The prose poems. I'm excited to read those.
Yeah. Second book is like 75% prose poems. Don't know how that happened, but here we are.
That's a big departure from this one. Jennifer, what about you?
Yeah, so I think like Jennifer Egan is pretty, interesting with like Goon Squad and Candy House. Zadie Smith does something different with structure every single time. And her most recent book, I guess, is just, I haven't read it yet, but it's like just, I think, historical fiction that she's like trying to write. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people read Carmen Maria Machado's memoir In the Dream House. That's like a fascinating work of structure. And Percival Everett, what I've read of his, he's always doing like interesting different things. And then I would say also this book I read not that recently, some years ago now, but I'm not like a poet, and I'm not a nonfiction writer either. But I'm always really interested when I encounter nonfiction or memoir that's like structured strangely. So In the Dream House. And then this book, The Suicide Index by Joan Wickersham, I want to say. And it's a memoir where she's just sort of contemplating her father's suicide, and she had resisted efforts to put it in any kind of order, like, linear, non-linear, like any kind of causal sequence. Like it just scrambled sequencing of any kind. So she just organizes it as an index where it's like, you look at, it's like, my father's, friend Fred or whatever. And then it's just like a cluster of memories about that. And then there's like another, and I just thought it was a very interesting way of like an interesting mapping of structure onto content in a way that felt very like organic. Joan Wickersham. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. If I don't get that from the chat, I'm going to email you for that. That sounds amazing. That list you gave was perfect. I'm going to email you for that. And Sarah, I know you're building a syllabus around this topic. So can you give us some insight into who you're thinking of when you're thinking of structure?
Well, and then, and I haven't actually I haven't figured out the syllabus yet, but I definitely will teach Janet Malcolm, who I've talked about, who I think appears to be writing straight nonfiction, but what she's often doing, like she has a book that's called In the Freud Archives, where she's like talks about Freudians like getting in fights. And it's very much like what she does a lot of times in her books is that like she lets the subject dictate the kind of form, both form and style. And so style is another question, but like there's like this sort of like psychoanalytic, like long Freudian, so this idea of like us being in an analyst session. There's that sense in the book, and it sort of starts to feel that way. And so I think there's a way in which she really allows the subject to sort of dictate the shape it takes. But the other book I was just thinking about what I've read recently, but Sheila Heti's Pure Color, I thought was really so weird and so brilliant and strange. And I've been thinking about what are books in which people use structure to think. And so a lot of it is actually people, I think, that are moving between fiction and nonfiction. And so that book very much feels like it's engaged in some sort of philosophy and kind of almost like biblical thought, but within the structure of story, but like things that happen, the turns are surprising. And then Hernan Diaz, Trust is like also has a 4-part structure that's really interesting, where the story keeps getting sort of retold and changed. And then Benjamin Labatut, who's really worked between fiction and nonfiction. And I'm teaching for another class, I'm teaching his When We Cease to Understand the World, I think was his story collection. But what's really interesting about that is that like each story is deeply sort of deeply ingrained in history, in real sort of science and history, but it moves from, and he explains it moves from like sort of the first story having just like one line that is invented to each story having more and more invention. And so that idea of I'm really interested in that idea of like structure also being dictated by like how much invention versus quote unquote fact there is, and that sort of balance I think is super interesting as well.
Oh, wow. My TBR pile just grew 5 sizes. Wonderful. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask is what's next for you? What are you working on, or where can the attendees find you next? Jennifer, how about you? At the next one page salon?
Probably probably at home with my small children. Yeah, I don't know. I was on a sabbatical this fall, so I was trying to see about writing another novel. It is like structurally, it's actually a book where I'm excited about the structure. Like the structure is really jazzy. It's like a cool premise, but so far it feels like there's something missing, like a deep question or some character stuff is missing. But the structure is, I think, pretty dope. But but I don't know. I don't know if it's going to turn into a novel yet. When I don't have like the right question, sometimes it just comes along, and sometimes it doesn't. And so we'll see.
Oh yeah, I went to your full disclosure. I went to your Texas Book Festival panel, and I loved what you said about when you arrive at a question that's irreducible. That's how you know when you have a book. I love that. So that's exciting. We'll have to have you back to hear about that one when it's done. Sarah, what about you? Where can we find you? What are you working on now?
Well, I just finished a new magazine piece that'll come out in December, early December, in the New York Times Magazine. And it's a sort of meta true crime that's set in West Texas. So that will be out soon. And that was really interesting to write because I was thinking about what are the, if you think about it sort of true crime arc, like what are the expectations of that? And if this is something that's trying to sort of think about true crime in a meta way, what are the ways in which you can both sort of play into and subvert that structurally? So that's coming out. And then I've also been on sabbatical this semester, and I started trying to write what might be a novel, but I'm not sure. So I've just been fiddling around.
Oh, that's exciting. Fiction.
But I love that, Jennifer, what you said about the idea of an irreducible question. I think that feels really essential to a new work.
Taylor, where can we find you next? What are you working on now?
I am fortunately moving into like a kind of quieter period of book tour before things kind of like kick back up at the top of next year. So I'm gonna hopefully use this downtime to actually put in some time on the YA novel in verse that I have started and then have been avoiding working on. So I'm gonna try to stop procrastinating and actually write the book, which is, as we all know, the fun part.
Yes. Oh, well, we're excited about that. And thank you all so much. This was a really, really incredible conversation, very enlightening. Your books are incredible. I pored over them. I love them. Y'all get these books if you haven't read them already. They are wonderful books, and you've just heard the geniuses who wrote them. And thank you all for joining us on a Thursday evening. Thank you for joining us at Third Thursday. And just to remind everyone, this is our last Third Thursday of the year. But please do join us in January. It will be the third Thursday of the month. And yeah, thank y'all. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Taylor, for all your wonderful insights and sharing with us. We've all learned so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Great.
And thank you, Sarah and Jennifer, for being here as well.
Oh, thank you for being here. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.